retribution, his revenge. He is your Street Fighter 6 Evo champion. 2017 didn't go his way, but that kid from Philly is on the stage, and he earned this Evo win. What an incredible...
In theory, we all like competitive integrity, but in reality, should the better player always win?
What? No, alright. I know that sounds bad.
As people, we like to know that our efforts are going to be rewarded. If we can be certain that the more effort we put in, the more success we'll get out of an activity, the more motivated we will be to improve and chase after victory. So that raises the question, are there reasons for developers to break this rule and allow weaker players to win? Well, the principle of loss aversion states that losing can feel twice as bad as winning feels good. This presents an interesting challenge for developers of competitive multiplayer games. If we know that players are going to be demoralized and demotivated by a 50-50 win-loss ratio, but that they also wouldn't appreciate insincere ego-boosting freebies that inflate the statistics of worse players up with their stronger competitors, how can we retain player engagement and statistical fairness in the multiplayer landscape? If you really stop to think about it, a lot of online discourse surrounding the multiplayer genre has its roots stemmed into this issue. Long has the discussion on skill-based matchmaking permeated the breadths of angry Twitter posts. And on the other side, you often see large discontent stem from games featuring comeback mechanics that make it easier for a player or team at a disadvantage to claw their way back onto equal footing. If you look deeply into these games, it becomes clear that almost no competitive experience is actually truly 100% fair. But that raises the question, what separates experiences that feel 100% fair from experiences that feel like they heavily reward the lesser skilled players? To find that out, let's look at some instances where game balance leans in either direction and determine whether these gameplay experiences strike a solid balance of player engagement and statistical fairness. A lot of shooter games have settled with their decision to leave skill-based matchmaking in at all levels of play. Rarely will you ever see a competitive game with the ranked game mode lacking matchmaking, but a lot of games secretly matchmake you off invisible casual ranks as well. This may seem a little strange, as these modes are advertised to the player with the allure of not being ranked. However, in reality, what they're doing is simply not telling you your rank. It's still there, just hidden from the player. However, this lack of information conveyance gets the job done pretty well, as players are able to relax more and are affected by losses less negatively as a result. This perceived lack of stakes lowers tension and loosens the tie between improvement and perceived skill, as no matter how good you get at casual play, you're not going to get flashy rank-up animations you can show off to your friends. This gives developers an opportunity to break game symmetry in order to allow for weaker players to have a more enjoyable experience. Game symmetry is pretty simply explained by the name alone, being an experience where all players compete under the exact same underlying set of rules. The most obvious example of a symmetrical game would be chess. Everyone has the same pieces, plays on the same board, and moves in the same ways. Except in a single match of chess, this actually isn't true. Whoever plays white always moves first, which is a tactile advantage over the other player. That's why at the highest level of competition, Grand Finals, chess matches are played as a set of multiple games. That way, both players get a chance to play white and black. Furthermore, in many first-to-one chess tournaments, a color pairing algorithm is employed to ensure all players receive a close to 50% ratio of white and black games throughout the whole tournament. However, in casual matches, usually the player's color is decided on a coin flip. This impacts the game's competitive integrity negatively, as the luckier player is now rewarded in addition to the more skilled player. This is also seen in many multiplayer team games' casual modes. Team shooters like TF2, Overwatch, Rainbow Six, and Valorant have game modes built around an asymmetrical attack and defense structure of gameplay, and due to the innate impossibility of balancing an asymmetrical game to 100% perfection, either attack or defense tends to be favored for victory. In competitive matches, these games force teams to play an equal amount of games on attack and defense in order to decide the match. In contrast, Overwatch and TF2's casual matches are first to one, meaning one team is randomly assigned to attack and one to defense. This adds an aspect of luck that is mostly unnoticeable unless you're really paying attention to it, but does subtly skew match results potentially in the favor of a weaker player. It's hard to get mad at this kind of unfairness, as even though each match does hold an uncontrollable luck-based element that results in player advantage, over the course of a play session, you're unlikely to skew heavily in one direction over the other. Additionally, game designers work as hard as they can to make this attacker-defender-sided advantage as minimal as possible. And while competitive play does retain symmetry in most cases, many competitive game modes when stretched to their limit do break symmetry to tiebreak, with one team ending up playing a bonus round on the potentially more favorable side and the other team drawing the short end of the stick. It's interesting to note that while this certainly does serve to level out a player's experience with small instances of luck, many of these instances of asymmetry are to prevent stalemates or reduce match time. Many people queuing for casual game modes simply don't have the time to play multiple rounds on attack and defense, and when there's no rank involved, the people who do have the time aren't going to be as frustrated if they draw the weaker side. Valorant stands out as an example that vehemently refuses to give either team an advantage, forcing teams to tiebreak by winning a round on attack, followed immediately by a round on defense. If you win one and lose the other, the game will make both teams vote on whether they wish to draw the match or do another round of tiebreakers. This means that a Valorant match can technically go on for infinity should every player agree to keep playing, but often competitive games will force a tie to avoid this problem. The existence of these asymmetrical casual game modes provides a solid learning ground for less experienced players, giving them a space to practice with less stakes and a higher impact from luck, which will let them observe what gameplay decisions result in success and which result in defeat. These game modes do result in the better player losing on unbalanced maps some of the time, but the separation between symmetrical and asymmetrical game modes provides spaces both for players who play simply for fun and aren't concerned with the competitive integrity of their match, and for players who want to compete, improve, and rise up the ranks. Symmetry and the separation of it is a common design principle in competitive games, and nowhere else is that more clear than in fighting games. As far as esports goes, fighting games are one of the most clear examples of a symmetrical gameplay experience. Every player plays on the exact same stage, has access to the exact same roster of characters, and fights for the sole goal of reducing your opponent's HP to 0. Even still, this symmetry is frequently broken in order to provide a more varied gameplay experience. While it is true that every player has access to the same selection of characters barring DLC and whatnot, in 99% of instances, an actual match between two fighting game players will not be 100% fair. This discrepancy is a result of matchups. In symmetrical games, oftentimes players are given the option to choose a limited number of tools from a larger set to bring to a match, and each of these tools function differently than the rest of the pack. Imagine if in chess, you could arrange the pieces of your board in any order, just so long as you use 8 pawns, a queen, a king, and 2 of everything else. Certain setups would be innately disadvantaged against other setups, and while there certainly would be setups that provide the most safety and the least likelihood for a bad matchup, it's inevitable that someone bordering on the line of creativity and insanity would develop a setup with the sole purpose of beating yours. This analogy is a good way to look at the roles selectable characters have in designing multiplayer games. No two characters are built the same, and some may have advantages unique to them that exploit disadvantages unique to others. This has a major impact on character viability, and nowhere is that more prevalent than in fighting games. These character-to-character matchups are so important that many players create charts to demonstrate what characters they think their main wins or loses against. As with the asymmetry with attack and defense style games, developers try their best to make sure all characters have an equal chance of winning against all characters. But even more so than with map design, this proves to be more of a get it as close as you can situation. If you design characters with defined strengths and weaknesses, it's only a matter of time before a clear poor matchup rears its head. Take a character like everyone's favorite sickle-slinging Brit, Axel. His strengths include his extremely long range, his ability to keep his opponents safely at arm's reach, and his solid damage off securing hits when the opponent gets too greedy. Now, place him against a character like Potemkin, whose core strength is that he ever gets close to you, the round ends almost immediately, but is weakened by the fact that he has an incredibly difficult time actually getting close to you due to his slow movement, attacks, and poor reward at his longest ranges. It doesn't take a genius to see that Axel comes out as a clear favorite here, and even though in the most recent game featuring these characters, Potemkin and Axel have both been re-kitted to make the matchup between them as fair as possible, Axel still comes out on top ever so slightly. This aspect of competitive game design affects the inherent balance of a match. In a bad matchup, the better player becomes increasingly less likely to win. If you remove that aspect of the game, everyone has to play the exact same character, and all of a sudden we're playing Street Fighter 1 and nobody is having fun. In instances like these, it's inarguable that the better player will sometimes lose, but we agree it's a necessary evil to keep the game expressive and enjoyable. This does raise the question though, Where is the cutoff at which point we begin to refute a game's systems as being competitively unfair, even if they add more enjoyment to the game overall? Is it, I don't know, intentionally kneecapping certain frustrating playstyles so that better players playing them don't frustrate worse ones? Well, if we look into the world of live service competitive games, we can come to a pretty definite no, believe it or not, as many different games across multiple genres have a storied history of keeping frustrating options intentionally underpowered to allow newer, less experienced players to have a more satisfying experience. All we need to do to find an example is look back 3 paragraphs in our script here, as Axel and Potemkin represent character archetypes in fighting games that are often intentionally kept underpowered. Characters like Axel are commonly referred to as zoners, and characters like Potemkin are called grapplers, and if you're looking to get into a new fighting game without any prior knowledge into the game's tier list, a smart, educated guess would be to avoid characters like these.
I don't want that.
Developers often keep characters with Axel's extremely long-range normal attacks and Potemkin's insanely high-damage throws weaker on purpose, as to avoid player frustration when fighting them. But why are these characters so frustrating in the first place? Well, there's a lot we can dive into, but to put it the most simply, it's because they are built around exploiting mistakes. Axel is a character with extremely dominant control over the screen and can convert his hits into a combo from farther than anyone else, meaning if you're a beginner who isn't quite comfortable with utilizing your character's approach options yet, you're going to lose the entire match one tiny hit at a time before you're even able to get a single attack in. This creates a lot of frustration, as the work the opponent has to do to approach Axel is much harder than the work Axel has to do to keep them out. And if you don't have a good grasp on the risk-reward balance of the game and its characters, which most beginners don't, fighting Axel can feel innately unfair. Of course, the better you get at the game, the more you start to realize this initial outlook was false. Axel has great long-range attacks and screen coverage, but due to his high recovery on most attacks, low HP, slower movement, and weak offensive and defensive options, he tends to be pretty weak when played at a top level. In the most recent Guilty Gear game Axel is playable in, he can only really be argued to be in the middle section of a tier list. In Xrd he's almost definitively bottom 3, and in Plus R he makes a notable exception, popping in slightly above the majority of characters. This trend is mirrored exactly by Potemkin, who's mediocre at best in Strive, terrible in Xrd, and pretty solid in Plus R. However, these are just the 2 characters I'm using as an example. If you take a look at almost any fighting game, you're very likely to see these trends repeated, and if they aren't, there's usually some level of rule breaking that makes said character stand out from their low-tier brethren. A good example of this is Dalsim, who similarly to Axel is quite weak in a majority of his appearances, except in Street Fighter V. However, in that game, Dalsim actually has incredibly potent offensive pressure with his slides, dive kick, teleport mix-ups, and set play fireball. As for grapplers, Zangief is also usually quite weak, but has an exceptional appearance in Street Fighter IV, where he sports a powerful, fast, long-range attack that slips through fireballs that no designer would dare give to a character of his stature ever again. It's important to note that while this bias is generally seen in a lot of games, there are some exceptions. The Mortal Kombat series frequently has zoners in the upper tiers of their roster, and King of Fighters often has grapplers at the front of the pack. Speaking of grapplers, we finished Axel's segment, but why are characters like Potemkin generally kept weak? Just like Axel, Potemkin is a character about exploiting mistakes, but he does it in his own unique way that the developers also felt the need to keep intentionally underpowered. Potemkin is a character about his crushing offense, only needing 1 to 2 openings to win a round, with the real challenge being actually forcing his way in and winning said round. However, if 2 weaker players are playing, neither one of them is going to be apt at the neutral state of the game. And while Potemkin's high HP keeps him alive for longer as he gets tickled for mistake after mistake, as soon as the enemy player makes a mistake, it becomes possible for Potemkin to force them into a guess-for-game situation with his extremely powerful throw, which, again, can feel unfair to less skilled opponents. If you're familiar with fighting games, you'll have heard that these 2 archetypes prey on 2 major emotions that their kits are designed to force you to feel. For Axel, that emotion is frustration. From the start of every round, Axel is at an advantage. Rounds that Axel wins last much longer than rounds his opponent wins, and he excels at making the opponent feel foolish for each decision they make. For Potemkin, that emotion is fear. The knowledge that at any moment Potemkin may throw out an attack that could rob you of your entire life bar causes you to make mistakes. Following these mistakes, his ability to put you in a guess-for-game situation where one wrong call could lead to a defeat means victories with Potemkin leave some players feeling cheated out of a win they felt they deserved. These emotions of fear and frustration are put first and foremost in matches against our two friends here, and if you're inexperienced with dealing with them, it can lead to serious discontent with the character or even the game itself. New players will find themselves getting frustrated easier rushing into Axel's attacks, which will cause them to make brash, aggressive decisions, and wouldn't luck have it, that's exactly what Axel is waiting for, and he'll promptly blow them up as a result. Potemkin will leave these players feeling terrified of even standing anywhere close to him, constantly wasting opportunities, moving not enough or way too much, and flailing when on the defensive. And wouldn't luck have it, that's exactly what Pot is waiting for, and he'll promptly blow them up as a result. The exploitation of mistakes a beginner player would be more likely to make leaves characters like Potemkin and Axel in an awkward spot where they see disproportionate success at lower levels compared to higher levels, and developers have known this for a long time. This creates a discrepancy in the player base's perception of strength for these two characters. While the top 1% may understand that if you play around Axel and Pot's weaknesses, you have a high chance of success, 99% of players won't even know what these weaknesses are, and even if you told them, they likely don't care enough about the game to learn to exploit them. You frequently see beginner players complaining about the overpoweredness of characters like Axel, citing the inability to fight back at all when up against a zoner more knowledgeable in the game than them, and the same can be said for grapplers as well. If you just flat out removed these character archetypes, you'd not only alienate a large portion of the player base who enjoys playing them, you'd also lose a sense of proportionality within the tools the game allows you to choose. It's no coincidence that these two characters lie on the opposite ends of the spectrum of range, and if you removed both the longest range characters and the shortest range characters, you'd be stuck with a less interesting game with fewer options to choose from. This problem has led developers to intentionally making these types of characters underpowered at a high level of gameplay as a means to ally the character's strength with what the majority player base perceives it is. This is potentially the clearest cut example we have of developers intentionally designing a set of mechanics so that the worst player wins more often. Except this isn't even the only genre to do this, and it's actually eerie how close our next dilemma comes to this fighting game related example. Here, let me show you how close. Take this guy, now put him in 3D, give him guns, and there you go. You probably see where I'm going with this. If grapplers are as short range gets, and zoners are as long range gets, then it wouldn't be a stretch to call shotguns grapplers and snipers zoners. Other than the fact that shotguns don't tend to pick you up in spinning pile driver you, of course. The shotgun and the sniper are common points of contention among FPS players for almost the exact set of reasons I listed in our fighting game section. Sniper rifles are able to attack you at ranges where you can't deal any damage, causing you to get impatient and end up right in their scopes. Its counterpart, the shotgun, mirrors grapplers by lurking around tight corners and forcing you to take gunfights so close that the reduced field of view from a scope becomes a deadly weakness, pumping you with high damage shells that can kill in one shot should you find yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time. As a result, we often see these weapons either intentionally undertuned or exceptionally hard to acquire to reduce player frustration. However, while the shotgun tends to find itself nerfed to mediocrity just like its grappler brethren, we actually see the sniper stay a pretty strong and consistent option in a lot of shooter games, and I think I know why. You see, it all comes down to player perception of skill. When talking about Axel earlier, we mentioned how his screen coverage is significantly higher than all of the cast, being able to attack from distances the opponent could never reach. This is true of the sniper, but where one attack from Axel can cover upwards of 20% of the entire screen, a single shot from a sniper rifle exists only as a small straight line across a sprawling map, certainly not covering even a single percentage of overall screen space. This leads to a disconnect from the player's idea for how skillful each tool is to use, where because it's easier to hit your chain attacks as Axel than it is to hit snipes with a sniper, the sniper must be the game's most skillful weapon, and Axel must be the game's least skillful character. In reality, this isn't quite the case. The game is balanced to proportionally reward the users of these tools based on the context they exist in. Axel's long-range attacks don't do very much damage, and they leave him quite vulnerable if he misses, and while a sniper rifle is significantly vulnerable after a single miss, most games allow them to one-shot any opponent with a shot to the head, and depending on the gun, maybe even the body too. While snipers do see just about as much complaining as zoners do, the simple fact that we perceive the sniper wielder as better than the opponent they killed means there's less of a need to intentionally weaken the tool. In stark contrast, many see people who play zoners as cowards who are worse at the actual game than the people they're zoning, pressuring developers to weaken those characters to make the match results more resemble these players' perceived notion of skill between them and their opponent, even if the zoner is actually much better. So, We've looked at ways games allow for worse players to still experience victories over a long play session due to small amounts of game asymmetry, and we've discussed how player perception of strength and skill can impact how fairly balanced certain polarizing tools are. However, we haven't looked at any examples where it's clear, even from a passing glance, that the game wants the worst player to win. And while that sounds like a far-fetched idea, and game designers designing a game with the express purpose to make sure the worst player beats the better player is certainly hyperbole in its boldest form, there are examples of mechanics in games designed to give an edge exclusively to weaker players that better players are excluded from. If I had you play a game of Hangman right now and put up these 2 blank words consisting of 8 letters each, I bet a large amount of you could guess what words I just put up. Comeback mechanic. If you're a gamer, you probably know what a comeback mechanic is, and if you're a competitive gamer, you probably already attach a pretty negative stigma to it. Chess has no comeback mechanics. If you're losing in chess, you have to claw your way back to victory the hard way, or resign early and learn from your defeat. Now, imagine if when you were the first player to be placed in check, you could bring any one of your pieces back from the dead. That would be a comeback mechanic. Comeback mechanics are implemented in games to help the losing players get back into the fight, and are often a point of contention among more hardcore fan bases. By definition, a comeback mechanic is unfair. The player who is performing worse receives a benefit for performing worse that the higher performing player never gets. Our competitive mindset, as people who want to be rewarded for skill, should tell us that such a thing shouldn't even be given a passing thought, never implemented into any serious competitive game. However, they keep showing up. Why? Well, as mentioned before, there's loss aversion. While the most objective end to an experience is the end of a round or game, losing smaller scale interactions more frequently doesn't feel good either. It sounds pretty backwards to say that if you're significantly better than your opponent in a fighting game, they should never get a chance to actually try to play it, because they'll have nothing to learn off of, and have 0 positive experiences within these matches. Comeback mechanics can exist on a small scale in these instances, such as meter being awarded to players for taking damage, which allows them to activate powerful invulnerable supers to stop the opponent from running them over and claw their way back into the game. However, these are comeback mechanics that exist at the smallest of scales. Oftentimes, while you are rewarded meter for losing in fighting games, you're awarded even more of it for winning interactions, so it's more there to level out the playing field as opposed to directly hoist the weaker player out of a disadvantage. You can find small-scale comeback mechanics like this in shooter games as well. In many game modes, the winning team needs to put in more effort to score a match-winning point than the losing team does to gain points of their own. This is very clearly seen in a lot of Overwatch's game modes, where the closer one team gets to a victory, the closer the losing team's spawn points are to the objective, and the farther the winning team's spawns are. This small-scale comeback mechanic is actually not that intrusive to competitive integrity, as while the losing player is being rewarded, they'll inevitably have to climb that same hurdle if they want to end up winning. This type of mechanic only really adds the perception of a back-and-forth game flow. The real type of comeback mechanic we look down upon isn't one of those that rewards consistency. If we want to look at a comeback mechanic that actively benefits weaker players and breaks away from the consistency of stronger ones, we'll have to get a little more wild. The most obvious example of this type of mechanic would be Mario Kart's item system. In Mario Kart, the items a player gets from the item box are determined based on how far away they are from first place. The racer in first will only ever get simple items like shells, bananas, and coins, whereas players in the back of the pack will be rewarded with blue shells, lightnings, and bullet bills, items which can hit the racer at the front without any way for them to stop them, adding a heavy amount of randomness to the game's outcome. But Mario Kart is first and foremost a party game. Nintendo designed it to be a fun experience for the whole family, so it makes sense that it would reward weaker players. It's not designed to be taken seriously by 99% of its player base. If we want to see comeback mechanics that exist in competitive experiences, we'll need to take a look back into the fighting game scene at a few games' most divisive features. Given that we talked about Dhalsim before, I find it natural to use Street Fighter V as our example of a fighting game with an intrusive comeback mechanic. Street Fighter V featured a system mechanic titled the V system, which gave unique selectable options to each character that could be mixed and matched to the player's preference. One of these was your V skill, a simple unique action not unlike a special move, and the other was V-Trigger. V-Trigger could only be activated once the red bar at the bottom of the screen was filled up, and it granted an extreme power boost to certain attributes of a character. How do you fill that bar, you may ask? Well, if I didn't clue you in over the last 20 minutes, you build that bar by being worse. Your V-meter only builds in 2 ways, taking damage and landing your V skill. Now, this all sounds well and good, but the amount you got from landing a V skill was extremely negligible, and even then, a vast majority of characters couldn't consistently get this to happen over the course of a match, meaning 9 times out of 10 you'd see V-Trigger get activated. It was because the user had just taken a chunk of damage from their opponent. Now, you may be thinking that this ends up working out similarly to our standard meter example, as in order to win a match, you'll need to give your opponent the same opportunity to build V-meter as they give you, but in reality, it didn't end up working out this way. Due to V-Trigger's large boost to a character's offensive capabilities, in certain instances it felt like winning early interactions in Street Fighter V matches would just lead to dealing 20% or so to the opponent's life, giving them V-Trigger, losing neutral to their more powerful toolkit, taking 50% or so damage before they run out of V-Trigger, and then being forced to play the rest of the match with just a sliver of health. Even though we secured the advantage first, we were punished for playing well, and ended up defeated without a fair lesson for us to learn from. And while this is a hyperbolized and heavily simplified example, this really is what V-Trigger felt like. Because of this mechanic stemmed a lot of controversy from the fighting game community, many of which believed the mechanic to be wholly uncompetitive. And even if you liked Street Fighter V as a game and didn't find V-Trigger as intrusive as its critics, they did objectively have a point there. But let's not just make this a dunk session on Street Fighter V. Is there any strategic benefit that players can exploit out of V-Trigger? Well, there most certainly is. Given that V-Trigger has a vulnerable activation period and generally doesn't make characters that much stronger on defense, it can't be used as a get-out-of-jail-free card when pressured by the opponent. To that end, top players occasionally began intentionally planning out their openings such that their combos would leave the opponent just outside of V-Trigger activation range, so that they could score one more solid hit before the risk of V-Trigger would be introduced into the round. Fighting games aren't strangers to these types of mechanics, with DBFC's Sparking, UMVC3's X Factor, and Tekken's Range Mode all being buffs activated by reaching a low health threshold that can let the losing player come back from the brink of defeat. And even then, these mechanics can all be played around by a skillful player through resetting combos and other means. While these mechanics are the worst of the worst when it comes to breaking competitive integrity for the sake of rewarding weaker players, it would be incorrect to say they don't add anything to the games they're in. V-Trigger, X-Factor, Sparking, and Rage are all extreme spectacles that get crowds of spectators hyped to see huge combos, and they introduce a unique aspect of decision-making for the stronger player that really forces them to prove they're better by outsmarting the game's mechanics and overcoming the odds. They may push the limit on what we consider to be fair to competitive integrity, but across the bigger picture, the better player is more likely to win in each of these games, proven by the top players of each scene remaining more consistently strong at every event you look at. So, should the better player always win? I know it's a tough pill to swallow, but to be honest, no. If you're designing an experience to be taken seriously, you may not want to implement blatant comeback mechanics like X Factor or V-Trigger, but making small sacrifices to competitive integrity to keep weaker players entertained as they improve is a surprisingly important step to an engaging competitive experience. The good that selectable characters bring to a competitive experience isn't outweighed by the bad they bring by introducing potential bad matchups or incorrect player skill perception. The struggle to capture a final control point compared to the ease of defending it loses its frustration when you consider that you're doing exactly what your opponent is going to need to do to win later on. But what do you think? Do you believe that any game that plans on taking itself seriously should never even consider throwing the worst player a bone every now and then? Or do you think that people will never engage with a game's systems if they aren't given an opportunity to play and understand what winning looks like? Let me know in the comments below, and if you have any examples of gameplay asymmetry, comeback mechanics, or anything you have to say regarding the subject, I'm pretty good about reading all the things you guys have to say, so be sure to let me know. This sure ended up being a long one, but for now though, that's all. This has been Adventure, and I hope to see you in the next one. Peace.